On July 19, 1952, radar operators at Washington National Airport began tracking 7 unidentified radar targets over the most heavily protected airspace in the United States. No transponders, no flight plans. Some appeared near restricted airspace surrounding the White House and the Capitol. Air Defense Command was notified. Minutes later, controllers using a separate radar system at the same airport confirmed the same targets independently. Fighter interceptors were scrambled. Pilots later reported lights maneuvering in ways no known aircraft of the time could match. 1 week later, it happened again. By the summer of 1952, the United States had spent 7 years preparing for an enemy it might never see. Not a declared war, a Cold War, fought through radar coverage, fighter readiness, and the constant fear of an attack that could arrive without warning. Radar technology was advancing rapidly, but it was still imperfect, and it was the only early warning system the country had. Washington National Airport operated some of the most sensitive civilian radar equipment in the country. 10 miles away, Andrews Air Force Base ran its own independent military radar coverage. Both systems watched the same sky for the same reason. Because in 1952, anything unidentified in restricted airspace was treated as a potential threat. That spring, public attention on the subject had already begun to build. In April, Life magazine published a feature asking whether flying saucers could be extraterrestrial in origin. By June, the Air Force had logged over 6 times as many sightings as it had in March. By midsummer, the country was primed. It didn't yet know that 2 weekends in July would become one of the most investigated UFO incidents in American history. At 11:40 p.m. on Saturday, July 19th, air traffic controller Edward Nugent noticed 7 objects on his radar scope. 15 miles south-southwest of the city, no known aircraft were in the area. The objects were not following any established flight path. Nugent called his superior, Senior Controller Harry Barnes. The first assumption wasn't mystery. It was equipment failure. Barnes had 2 other controllers check the equipment. The radar was working normally. He later wrote, "We knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft." Barnes called the airport's separate radar-equipped control tower. Controllers Howard Coughlin and Joe Zacco confirmed the same unidentified blips, independently on their own screen. They also saw something outside the tower window, a bright light, hovering, then departing at, in Coughlin's words, incredible speed. Coughlin turned to Zacco. "Did you see that? What the hell was that?" Other objects began appearing across every sector of the radar scope. Several radar returns appeared in the vicinity of the White House and the United States Capitol. Barnes called Andrews Air Force Base. Andrews reported nothing unusual on their radar. Within minutes, that changed. Airman William Brady in the Andrews Tower saw an object he later described as like an orange ball of fire trailing a tail, unlike anything I had ever seen before. As Brady tried to alert the rest of the tower, the object took off at an unbelievable speed. On a national airport runway, Capital Airlines pilot S.C. Pierman sat in his DC-4 waiting for clearance. Over the next 14 minutes, in direct radio contact with Barnes, he observed 6 objects. White, tailless, fast-moving lights. Barnes later confirmed the correlation directly. Each sighting coincided with a pip we could see near his plane. When he reported that the lights streaked off at high speed, it disappeared on our scope. At Andrews, Staff Sergeant Charles Davenport observed an orange-red light to the south. It would stand still, then abruptly change direction and altitude. This happened several times. At one point, both radar centers at National Airport and the radar at Andrews were tracking the same object, hovering over a radio beacon. It vanished from all three scopes at the exact same instant. At 3 a.m., two Air Force F-94 interceptors arrived over Washington from Newcastle Air Force Base, Delaware. The moment they entered the airspace, every unknown object vanished from National Airport's radar. The jets ran low on fuel. They left. The objects returned. Barnes later speculated that the objects appeared to respond to radio traffic. The last unknown contact was logged off the scope at 5:30 a.m. By Monday morning, the incident had become national news. Saucers swarm over Capitol. 1 week later, it happened again. At 8:15 p.m. on Saturday, July 26th, a pilot and stewardess aboard a National Airlines flight approaching Washington observed lights above their aircraft. This was not an isolated report. Within minutes, both radar centers at National Airport and the radar at Andrews Air Force Base were tracking unknown objects again. At Andrews, Master Sergeant Charles Cummings observed the objects directly. He later said, "These lights did not have the characteristics of shooting stars. There were no trails. They traveled faster than any shooting star I have ever seen." Project Blue Book's press spokesman, Albert Chopp, arrived at National Airport. Citing security concerns, he denied reporters' requests to photograph the radar screens. He then joined the radar room himself. By 9:30 p.m., the radar room was once again detecting numerous unidentified contacts across multiple sectors of the scope. Some moved slowly. Others reversed direction and crossed the screen at speeds some radar returns were later estimated to approach 7,000 miles per hour. At 11:30 p.m., two F-94 Starfire interceptors arrived from Newcastle Air Force Base. Flight leader Captain John McHugo was vectored toward the radar contacts. He saw nothing, despite repeated attempts. His wingman did not have the same experience. Lieutenant William Patterson saw 4 white lights and gave chase. He later told investigators, "I tried to make contact with the bogies below 1,000 feet. I was at my maximum speed, but I ceased chasing them because I saw no chance of overtaking them." According to Albert Chopp, who was monitoring ground control, Patterson radioed a single question. "I see them now, and they're all around me. What should I do?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew what to tell him. After midnight, Major Dewey Fournay, Project Blue Book's liaison at the Pentagon, and Lieutenant John Holcomb, a Navy radar specialist, arrived at the National Airport radar room. During the night, Holcomb received a call from the Washington National Weather Station. A slight temperature inversion, they told him, was present over the city. The explanation would soon become central to the Air Force's public response. Holcomb didn't believe it was strong enough to explain what he was watching. He called the returns good and solid. Fournay later relayed that everyone present in the radar room that night was convinced. The targets, they believed, were most likely solid, metallic objects. Neither Fournay nor Holcomb would be in the room 1 week later, when the Air Force explained to the country what they believed had happened. 2 more F-94s were scrambled before sunrise. One pilot saw nothing. The other moved toward a white light. It vanished the moment he closed in. As on the previous weekend, the sightings ended at sunrise. By Sunday morning, the headlines had returned, louder than before. By that afternoon, according to later accounts, President Truman had his Air Force aide call Project Blue Book directly, demanding an explanation. Truman listened in on a separate line. He asked nothing. 2 weekends, 2 independent radar facilities, controllers, pilots, airmen, a Navy radar specialist, none describing exactly the same thing, but all describing the same pattern. The Air Force could no longer treat it as a rumor. 3 days later, they called the largest press conference held in Washington since the end of World War II. Three days later, the Air Force responded. On July 29, 1952, the largest press conference in Washington since the end of World War II began. Major General John A. Samford, the Air Force's Director of Intelligence, addressed the room. He was joined by Major General Roger M. Ramey, the Director of Operations. In his opening statement, Samford addressed the volume of reports the Air Force had received since 1947.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
He said, "A certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things." Samford offered 2 explanations. Visual sightings, he said, could be attributed to misidentified stars or meteors. The unknown radar targets he attributed to temperature inversion. The same condition Holcomb had dismissed as insufficient 5 days earlier in the radar room itself. Samford stated that the unknown radar contacts were not caused by solid material objects and therefore posed no threat to national security. When asked whether the Air Force had recorded similar contacts before the Washington sightings, Samford answered, there had been hundreds. All, in his word, fruitless. The room of reporters had a single, easy explanation to print. The next morning, headlines across the country echoed it. But not everyone in that room agreed. Captain Edward Ruppelt, head of Project Blue Book, later wrote that when he interviewed the radar and control tower personnel at Washington National Airport, not a single one of them agreed with the official explanation. Ruppelt also discovered something else. Hardly a night passed that summer without some degree of temperature inversion over Washington. Yet the slow-moving, solid radar targets had appeared on only a handful of nights. The explanation also faced criticism from outside the Air Force. A Weather Bureau official noted that temperature inversions typically appeared on radar as broad, steady returns, not as individual moving targets. The officers who had spent the night inside the radar room were not the ones presenting the Air Force's explanation. Public attention moved on. The disagreement inside the Air Force itself did not. And more than 70 years later, people are still debating what those radar operators actually saw. In the decades since, the temperature inversion explanation has remained the Air Force's official position. It has also remained the most disputed. In 1966, physicist James E. McDonald, investigating on behalf of the government-funded Condon Report, interviewed 4 pilot witnesses and 5 radar personnel from the case. His conclusion was direct. He called the Air Force's explanation physically impossible. Harry Barnes, the senior controller who first confirmed the July 19th sightings, told McDonald something specific. The radar targets, Barnes said, were not shapeless blobs such as one gets from ground returns under anomalous propagation. He remained certain. They were solid. Howard Coughlin, the controller who first saw the light outside the tower window, agreed with him. In 2002, 50 years after the sightings, Coughlin spoke to the Washington Post. He had not changed his position. I saw it on the radar screen and out the window. Not every account from that summer supports the witnesses' position. A B-25 bomber crew, vectored toward an unknown radar target during the second weekend, saw nothing unusual in the sky. The radar return they were chasing turned out to be a tour boat on the Potomac. It is a documented case of radar producing a false target that summer, and a reminder that not every return on the scope that July was unexplainable. The disagreement was never about whether radar could be wrong. It was about whether it was wrong every time. UFO researcher Jacques Vallée, writing in 1965, took a different view of the entire case. He described the Washington sightings as rather poor, and noted that within UFO researchers' own files, the case would be considered second-rate. Even among those who study these cases closely, there is no consensus. Not on what was seen, not on what it means. What remains part of the historical record is simpler. 2 weekends, multiple radar detections, multiple named witnesses, fighter interceptions, a presidential inquiry, an official explanation. Several of the personnel closest to the events later rejected it. More than 70 years of disagreement followed over whether that explanation was sufficient. The radar returns have faded. The witnesses are disappearing. The questions remain.